Well, good morning. Good to see everybody this morning. It started raining just as you all arrived. When I came in, it was still dry, but I didn't know we were going to get any today. Well, I'm glad you've made it in. We are going to conclude our Revelation series today, the Revelation 7. We've been, of course, walking through the 7 churches addressed at the opening of the book of Revelation. Those 7 churches that teach us something of ourselves. Again, if we look at the map, we kind of take this quick tour kind of up the western coast of Turkey, just inland from the coast for some of these churches, from Ephesus to Smyrna up to Pergamos, and then Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea. These are churches that help us learn about ourselves. They teach us about various types of churches, about the church perhaps as a whole over the course of history. And we've just been kind of diving in each week with one church to be maybe challenged by some of the things that they struggled with. It seems that every church has some sort of struggle. Some of those struggles are self-imposed. Others were to no fault of their own. And Christ addressed them openly and honestly. Today what we'd like to do is to look at the whole a little bit, just to kind of recap and wrap up where we've been. There are many scholars who believe that these churches give us a timeline, an overall history of the universal church that tell us something about the timing of God's plans. And so we're going to look at that today a little bit. Our structure for the conversation out of Revelation chapters 1 to 3 today is going to be a little different than probably is our kind of normal rhythm. I'm going to give you 3 kind of overall thoughts very quickly at the beginning. And they'll be kind of review for us a little bit. And then we're just going to settle in and take some time talking about church history from the time of Christ, specifically the time of John's writing, to today, and see if, in fact, these 7 churches tell us something of the life of the church universal. The Revelation opens, if we go back to chapter 1, with this statement. The revelation, in the NIV it says the revelation from Jesus Christ. Several translations say the revelation of Jesus Christ. King James, ESV, several others use the word of. Of or from, this is the revelation of Jesus. And it's important for us to remember that as we study the book of Revelation, it must always be done through the lens of Jesus Christ. Whether this is coming directly from him or it is about him, both statements, I would argue, are true. And so any study that we do, any time we spend unpacking the scriptures in the book of Revelation, we must look at them through the lens of Jesus Christ. When we make it about anything else, when we make it about the events or the timeline or the structure or other individuals that are mentioned in the book or the imagery and the symbolism and all of that, anytime that we take our attention off of Jesus as we study the book of Revelation, there are certain temptations that we often fall into. Sometimes we just get so caught up in the symbolism and the imagery that we desperately want to figure out, what was John seeing? Was he trying to describe future technology with a first century mindset? Are the symbols that are talked about, are they going back to Old Testament symbolic conversation and language that we see? And we get sometimes so caught up in the symbolism that we forget that this message is about the actions of Jesus Christ at the end of time as he ushers in eternity. It's about Jesus. It's about Jesus and what he does in order to bring about his eternal kingdom. And that is the heart of the story. That's the most important piece of everything that you will read in the book of Revelation. If we get caught up in all of these other things, sometimes we start to assume or think into certain conclusions that come from very, I'll say, egocentric perspectives. I can't tell you how many times I've heard messages about the book of Revelation that were more about the United States than Jesus or his people, Jewish or Christian or otherwise. Pastors are so tempted to make the book of Revelation all about ourselves. And so we read into the story, the account that Jesus gives John in the first century. We often read into that my story and my life and my people and my community and my nation. And that's a very dangerous thing to do. While it will affect all people on earth, the story isn't about you and me, it's about him. When we do this, we begin quite often to give primary attention to secondary themes or individuals. We elevate the schedule sometimes. I mean, how many Christian arguments over the past 2,000 years have been about whether Jesus and God's people are caught up in the air with him before the tribulation, in the middle of the tribulation, or after the tribulation. I mean, we could get into 3 sections right here and have just a heck of a good time arguing about that all afternoon, right? We've been doing it for 2,000 years. And at the end of the day, we still wouldn't all agree, because this is how it's gone for so long. And we get so tempted to try to figure out all the answers and to lay specifics to some things that we're just not meant to know yet. And all of that happens when we take Jesus off the throne and we put ourselves on the throne, or we put our concerns in the hands of other players that we read about in the book of Revelation, or we get concerned about what is life going to look like and am I going to have to live through it or not. We do all these things and we miss the point. That Jesus Christ is still God Almighty, ruler of the universe, King of kings, Lord of lords, and he is coming back for his people, that we might dwell with him eternally in his presence and to be blessed. And that's the point of the story. And he tells us this and then opens in the first couple chapters by giving specific instructions to these churches that we just looked at, giving specific instructions to them, saying, this is how you can faithfully walk toward my return. And that's so helpful for us. In fact, he does so, and because his message is so important, he tells us that those who will give themselves to study the revelation, understand what it's about, and apply it to their lives, that there is a special blessing for those who will do so. There's a blessing for those who both absorb and apply the message of the book of Revelation. Verse 3, again, right out of the gate. Verse 3 of chapter 1, blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear it. Not only those who read it and hear it, but he goes on to say, and to take heart what is written, because the time is near, or because the time will come quickly. You see, that tells me that the revelation is meant to be understood. While there are mysteries in it, certainly. While there are symbols and structures and events that we won't fully understand, overall, it's meant to be understood. Not only is it meant to be understood, but it's meant to be applied to our own faith walks as we grow in Christ. It's meant to be used. So how do we do so? Well, there is a process to interpreting and applying the scriptures that is correct, and there are all kinds of ways to interpret the scriptures that are unhealthy and incorrect. And so we've tried to be faithful to that as we've walked through chapters 2 and 3. The proper approach to understanding the scriptures is always, whether we're in the book of Revelation or somewhere in the Old Testament or in Paul's letters, the appropriate path is always to first and foremost understand the primary message. What was the original author saying to their original audience? Before we start thinking about what God is saying to us today, we must understand always what was he originally saying to his audience in the moment that it was written. And so, letters of the New Testament, what was Paul saying to the Ephesian church? Who were they? What were they dealing with? Why was he addressing this particular issue? What cultural significant things were happening that he was trying to make mention of and make them aware of and help move them through or past? What was Paul saying to the Ephesians or the Corinthians or the Colossians? What was Moses trying to portray and say to the Israelites when he wrote the first 5 books of the Old Testament? What was God's message to his people then? So first of all, we have to understand the primary or the immediate message to its original audience. Out of that, once we understand what the original author was saying to the original audience, then we can start to say, what were those guiding principles that are kind of universally true over time? Out of that, what does God say about himself or us that's always true? And from that, then we can take step 2 and we can begin to apply those messages and those principles, those truths to our own life and our own day. If we get those out of order, we read into the text something that wasn't meant to be there. So that's why, as we've walked through this series, we've taken time to say, what was Jesus saying to the church at Ephesus? What was their life like? We spent a little more time in this series. Who were the people? What kind of city did they live in? What were some of the blessings that they enjoyed in their day and their community? What was the personality or the character of that church? Understand the primary message and then understand what is Jesus saying to them. What's he saying about himself? What's he saying about them? What is he trying to help them to know or understand? And then make those relevant applications to ourselves. Then the third step, and only after we've done those first 2, sometimes there are scriptures that speak prophetically about events yet to come. In fact, we see it even in Revelation chapter 1, when Jesus tells John, "Write therefore," in chapter 1, verse 19, "what you have seen, what is now, and what will take place later." From the very beginning, Jesus tells John, "I'm going to tell you some things that have already happened. You're going to write those down. We're going to talk about some of the things that are happening, John, in your day, in your current time. And we're going to talk about some things. We're going to write some things down that haven't taken place yet." And so any prophetic application that looks beyond our own time or the time of writing, that looks to the forward, we have to be careful sometimes to keep those in their proper places. Certainly, God speaks of the future often in the scriptures, but any prophetic application should be embraced, I'll say liminally, or kind of on the edges. Like there might be a message there, but it's almost never the primary message. It's almost never the core message that is meant to be understood. It's usually a second or third or fourth layer of the message. And so we have made mention that these letters to the 7 churches are meant to be understood prophetically, perhaps. Many scholars believe so, but we've not talked about it much beyond mentioning that until today. So what I'd like to do is talk about church history. Now that we've looked at the churches very intimately and personally, we've learned what Jesus was saying to the church, we've applied some of those lessons to ourselves, now we can look at this third and fourth layer and say, was this also a prophecy to the universal church about the overall timeline and scope of God's, we'll say, schedule for the end of time? Revelation 7 as church history. You should have in your program, you should have a timeline stretched across the back that stretches from 0 AD to a little past 2020 or 2000 AD. Right? If you're a note taker, you can kind of use that if it's helpful. We're going to look at all 7 churches as 7 church periods, 7 church eras, 7 church ages, if you will. These are fairly commonly held. Something to be said about the dates that I'll share, they are all approximate. Okay? If you do an online search for the 7 church ages, there will be different dates given from one website to another, from one resource or commentary to another, one scholar from another, but they're all pretty close. Okay, so I'm going to give you some dates, but they're going to be approximate. The first church is the church at Ephesus. Most scholars would say that if this is a prophetic timeline over a long period of history, that the church at Ephesus is a reference to the very first days of the church after Christ's ascension, that this period of time probably lasts from sometime around 30 AD to around 100 AD. So we're talking about a 70-year period that is a time in which the apostles are leading the church, right? Christ ascends. He gives authority to those who had followed him, who were eyewitnesses to his ministry, to the Peters, James, and Johns of the world. You could include Paul into that, as he spent time with Christ, and then obviously was a prolific writer to the churches. But this is the apostolic church, or the post-apostolic church. It's a time when the church was passionate and working hard to spread the gospel. They were kind of moving around the Roman world. The word Ephesus, or the name Ephesus, literally is translated to the beautiful one, or the desired one. And certainly that would describe the church in its early days. The Bible tells us that there were several occasions where thousands of people came to follow Christ in single days. They were theologically sound. As you read through the New Testament, you see quite often where Paul is writing to churches, warning them against some false teachings that were starting to creep in, as there was this temptation to combine the teaching that the scriptures, the Old Testament, people had read and memorized and followed for centuries. Jesus came as the fulfillment of those scriptures, but they were living in a very Roman, kind of pagan world, and there was this constant temptation to mix the two, to blend the thoughts that people had from Greek and Roman mythology with Christianity. And so the church was pretty disciplined in fending off those heresies. So they were theologically sound. They experienced explosive growth across the Roman Empire. It was an exciting time for the church. While there was some persecution here and there, for the most part it was a good time to live. They were committed to righteous living. The people at this time desired to do that which was right and avoid that which was sinful or outside of God's commands for his people. But what happened? Often happens in our own lives. We see it personally. We see it in some churches, and we certainly saw it in church history. People come to Christ. They get excited about what's happening in their lives. They're committed to growing and learning the scriptures, to knowing who God is and what he desires of them, to living rightly in a way that would honor him and please him. And as they're committed to do so, they start to look around themselves and recognize, wow, not everybody else is doing this. There are those who have not yet given their lives to Christ. Maybe they have in name only, but their lives are still kind of messy, and I see them engaging in behaviors that the Bible specifically forbids. They look at those who have followed Christ for a long time, and they don't see the same zeal and passion. And so what happens in the life of a believer is they come to Christ, they get really excited, they start seeing God move in lives, they work hard to honor God, and then they quite often start to get a little critical of everyone else. They start to take on this attitude that my faith is somehow a little more sincere than others, and they get legalistic. And we see this in the New Testament as Paul writes from one church to another. We see the churches arguing over whether they can eat food sacrificed to idols or not, whether believers need to be circumcised or not, whether they should eat or drink anything kind of mind-altering state. Should we drink alcohol? Should we not? We still argue about some of these things today. And over time, this legalistic mindset sets in. It starts as a protective measure to hold us to righteous living, but if it continues on, our passion for God and our passion and our grace extended to others begins to wane. And what was the message to the church at Ephesus? You've lost your first love. I know your deeds. You work hard, you live righteously. And it's at this time in history that we saw early doctrines begin to creep in to the church of limited grace extended to other people. Christ came to forgive us our sins, and we recognize that we don't live under this old system anymore where we have to make continual sacrifices, knowing that I'm going to make a sacrifice to cover my sin, and then over the next week, when somebody cuts me off in traffic, or I feel like somebody has said something unkind or unfair about me, then I feel like I have to retaliate and say something unkind or unfair about that. Like we do all these things that we feel bad about, we feel guilty for. We recognize that they're sinful behaviors, but oh no, now it's on the backside of my sacrifice. In the old system, we'd go and make another sacrifice, but under Christ, we've been told that our sins, all of them, are forgiven. But what about the person who knows what's right and still chooses to do what's wrong? How many times does Christ's sacrifice cover them and offer forgiveness? Because there's some people, as I look at them, I start to think maybe they don't deserve to be forgiven an umpteenth time. Or their sin is way worse than my sin, and I know that I still screw up, but I don't intend to, and they seem pretty bent on intentionally engaging in sin over and over again. And so we start to play this kind of comparison game with each other, and it all is part of this lack of passion and grace. The church found themselves fighting each other a little bit. The church's passion started to wane. It gave itself to this kind of judgmental approach to what the church was and wasn't, and to those who didn't ascribe to all the same doctrines and thoughts. It became more and more self-protective, especially in the Roman Empire, as they started feeling this pushback against this growing movement of Christianity. From the Jewish faith, from the Roman secularism, from these other cults and pagan religions. And as they felt more and more pushback and more pressure, the church became more and more staunch in their own beliefs and practices. And this happened over the first 50 to 100 years of the life of the church. Then we move to the second period of history. The church of Smyrna was a real church that had a specific message, but many scholars believe that it also is a sample of a larger period of time from about 100 AD to around 312 to 325 AD, where the church faced increasing persecution. You might refer to this as the persecuted church. If the first church at Ephesus is symbolic of the post-apostolic church, this one would be the persecuted church. The word Smyrna sounds like the spice myrrh that we talk about when we refer to Christ's death and burial. The word myrrh means bitter, and certainly this was a bitter time for the church from 100 to 300 AD or so, where under 10 different Roman emperors, they faced incredible persecution. Thousands and thousands of Christians died during these years. Many of them made sport for the entertainment of the Roman world. In fact, a 2nd century church father named Tertullian said that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. As Christians faced this incredible persecution, many of them fled their homes, moved to different cities, tried to move away from the kind of the heart of the Roman Empire. And as they did, they took their faith with them. And so while they fled in incredible pain and grief, having lost family members and friends, businesses and homes, they took with them the gospel, and it spread through not just the Roman world, but across the known world at the time. The persecution that they faced really did, like a dandelion in the wind, spread the gospel. Their suffering led to its broad expansion, and in this time, Christ promised the church at Smyrna that there was something beyond this life, that there was life beyond the grave, that there was blessing, that he was guaranteeing himself. These are the words of him who is the first and the last, who died and came to life again. While you are facing death around every corner, you can trust my words, Jesus says. I am the one who was dead and has come back to life and has power over death. And I offer life to you beyond the grave, he says to the church at Smyrna, but largely to the church over a period of a little over 200 years, where they faced incredible persecution. He encouraged the church during this time, be faithful even to the point of death, and I will give you the victor's crown. This is an incredibly difficult time in history, from 100 to a little after 300, where no matter where you were, living as a follower of Jesus was dangerous business. It was no joke. Christians were marginalized, they were targeted, and quite often they were killed. The persecuted church. The third period of history coordinates with the church at Pergamum. Pergamum was a privileged church. They were wealthy. The message to them identifies that they were doing life pretty well. They had it pretty good. This is a period of time stretching, again, just a little over 200 years, from sometime around 312 AD until about 540 AD or so, give or take. This is the privileged church. The church went from being chased down and hunted and executed and martyred to being the state religion of the Roman Empire. Around 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine himself converted to Christianity. Now, if you look back over historic documents, Constantine wasn't a great Christian. He had a lot of things wrong, but he converted to Christianity, and he made Christianity the state religion of the Roman Empire. And so the church at this point in history went from fleeing and hiding and living underground to now being embraced by the most powerful empire that had ever existed on the planet. And as a result, those within the church went from being destitute and hiding to being influential and powerful. Church leaders had incredible opportunities. They had a platform and a voice because on Constantine's conversion, the Roman Empire kind of married the church. While that was good in the immediate sense, in that Christians were no longer being hunted down and killed, it wasn't all good for the church. Because what happened was, just as the state married the church, so Roman pagan culture married Christian culture. And theology and doctrine got pretty muddy for the church. I always think it's somewhat entertaining when people kind of pick the holidays that they embrace and pick the holidays that they push aside. Growing up, we were pretty careful about what we would and wouldn't participate in at Halloween in my house as a kid. But we were all in on Easter. Do you know Easter was actually a blend of Resurrection Sunday and a pagan fertility cult that celebrated and worshiped the goddess Astarte? She was a fertility goddess, and her feast would always take place on the first Sunday after the first full moon after the spring or vernal equinox. So the holiday moved around, right? Like, it wasn't always on the same date on the calendar. It took place always on a Sunday, but it was always in the spring. It was after that the days were even, right? 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. So once that point hit, then you would go forward until the next full moon, and then after the full moon, the very next Sunday. So sometimes it was very early in the year, sometimes it was a little bit later in the year, just like Easter. That's why sometimes Easter's in March and sometimes it's not till the end of April. But this fertility cult would celebrate their own wealth and prosperity of crops and of family by worshiping this goddess Astarte with symbols of fertility, like rabbits and eggs. And women would parade themselves around their villages almost completely, if not fully naked, wearing large bonnets and hats. Now, we've not embraced all of that, maybe the hats and the bunnies and the eggs. So that's not a suggestion, ladies, next Easter. Let's not take it too far. But our celebration of Easter still has as much pagan fertility goddess ritual as it does resurrection celebration. And it happened during this time in history, from 300 to 500 AD, when this Roman world full of mythology got blended with Christianity. The church adopted very secularized and civil authoritative structures. What had been a movement of the apostles and pastors and the laity reading the scriptures and applying to them their lives became a business model, a secular model where we had to have positions of authority, and we took on very secularized structures and authoritative structures where we began adding moral codes of conduct. Where Christ had given freedom, the church was taking that freedom back and putting in structures of what could and couldn't be done within the church. We started to see people, just like out of this Roman and Greek culture that worshiped all of these icons and half man, half God individuals, men and women of legend and lore. The church also began to elevate and worship those who had gone before us, who accomplished incredible things by the power of the Holy Spirit. We sainted them and elevated them above the rest of us. And we began to pray to their images and to their statues. We began to worship them as having power and authority, even though the risen Christ had called us to himself. The church began to blend themselves with culture. And what did Jesus say to this church? These are the words of him who has the sharp, double-edged sword. He says, you need to separate yourselves from these pagan rituals, from these sinful practices, from these destructive behaviors that we seem to be running back to. It was a period of history where the church had incredible opportunity and privilege, but began to engage in practices that were harmful. The next period lasts about 1,000 years, from 538 to sometime in the 1500s. The church at Thyatira was a powerful church. I would say this is the period of time where, probably compared to the rest of society and culture, the church was most powerful or influential. You might call this the powerful church, or perhaps the papal church, as the headquarters moved from Jerusalem to Rome after Constantine had adopted the church. And so the universal small c Catholic Church became the Roman capital C Catholic Church. It was still one church, now headquartered in Rome because of its power and its influence over society. They took on not just religious authority, but civil authority, political authority around the world. The church was very influential, building schools, hospitals, other civic organizations. The church had the money. They had the passion of those following their faith, and they had the political muscle. They began building massive cathedrals for God's glory. I think about the places where we invest our money today. What types of buildings do we invest in? Usually stadiums and sports facilities. But at this time, the most important thing they could do was to build houses of worship. It was a way to glorify God, but it was also something of a power move. Jesus says to this powerful, influential church, I know that now you are doing more than you did at first. They had resources for 1,000 years. To the one who is victorious and does my will to the end, I will give authority over the nations. If this doesn't describe the church of the medieval ages, I don't know what does. They had incredible power over the nations, over emperors and kings. Unfortunately, that also meant there was pretty incredible corruption that came into the leadership of the church at the time. Jesus says to the church at Thyatira, nevertheless, I have this against you. You tolerate the woman Jezebel into sexual immorality and the eating of food sacrificed to idols. It was during this 1,000-year period that the rest of the world refers to as the Dark Ages. It was during this time that the church began also worshiping a woman, elevating her to the same level as that of Christ. The church during this time looked a whole lot more like Babylonian mysticism than it did the apostolic church early in its days. There was incredible sexual sin tolerated by the church at this time. It was a dark time for the church. While it looked healthy and vibrant and authoritative, and it was moving culture in the way that the church deemed most appropriate, it was rotting on the inside. And then the response to that is the church at Sardis, marking years 15 to 1800. Might call this the persistent church, or the Protestant church, if you will. Sardis literally means escaping ones, or the ones who come out of. It describes a period of history when when certain individuals looked at what the church had become and saw real corruption that needed to be addressed. And they pushed against it. New doctrines arose to the surface. Sola Scriptura, sola fide, sola gratis, and sola Christus. These important core tenets: Scripture alone, faith alone, grace alone, Christ alone. These were positive moves. These were necessary changes to the church, and the church was reformed. Unfortunately, it wasn't revived. Christ says, you have a reputation for being alive, but you are dead. You see, as the Protestant movement gained steam and popularity, they too married themselves to the state. The Lutheran Church married itself to the state of Germany. There was this incredible battle for influence and power, this schism between Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. These two arms and branches of one church fighting for influence and power and authority, leveraging their influence with European kings, English majesty, French kings and queens. You see, the church was still hungry for institutional power. We added or continued other doctrines that guaranteed salvation under the authority and the banner of the church rather than Christ. If the church offers baptism, it doesn't matter what happens to your child. If the church offers forgiveness or rights, then you can live as you want the rest of the week. And this was in both the Protestant and the Catholic churches. You have a reputation for being alive, but in fact, you are dead, is the message to the church at Sardis. And it would have been an appropriate message to the Protestant church from the 1500s to the 1800s. This led to expansion again of the church. As North America was explored and people moved to the United States, people moved to Canada, people moved west, we see a period of time that looks much like the address to Philadelphia. From around 1700 to 1900, we have this, again, productivity increase. The productive church emerges as European rivals kind of lead to this global missionary movement. While it grew out of this intense competitive kind of approach to expansion, we see people move to new areas of the world for the purpose of presenting the gospel, of proselytizing and evangelizing new people groups. This meant that those living on the frontiers were the ones that were offering forgiveness for sin and faith. We see humble servants on the frontiers in North America leading the missionary movement. Not from high church, not from institutions of higher education, but simple men and women. It looked much more like the early church, like the church at Ephesus, than the last 1,500 years. They advanced out of the church's great love for her neighbors, finally, like the church at Philadelphia, praised for their love and good deeds. And then we come to the last church, the church at Laodicea. Laodicea was a prosperous city, a prosperous church, and I think we would say that the church has been prosperous from an earthly standpoint since the 1900s. Unfortunately, we also look much like the church at Laodicea, which literally means the people's personal opinions. from the word laos, or people, and dikatzo, personal opinion or decree. We live in a day where the church lives by the people's personal opinions, not by the scriptures, but by how we feel life ought to be, or what would a good and loving God say? And without exploring the scriptures to see what he says, we inject our own opinions about what he says. The church at Laodicea, and the church, I would say today, is the most apostate of all, having abandoned religious structures and beliefs and doctrine that God himself had given us in his own word. Revelations 3:17 says, "Because you say I am rich, I've acquired wealth, and I don't need a thing, but you don't realize that you're wretched, pitiful, poor, blind, and naked." You see, the church often feels pretty self-sufficient. We compromise the word of God as a whole for politically correct stances. Ultimately, a church that's willing to compromise, just like we saw in the Dark Ages, to maintain fiscal prosperity and social acceptance, will be led ultimately away from God, just like his people have been from the very beginning. And so we have 7 church ages. From the time of John's writing carrying through today. Is this the message of the Revelation 7? It's not the primary message. It might not even be the most applicable message to each or every one of us. But I do think it helps us understand the natural inclination of the human heart, both individually and corporately, and we ought to protect ourselves against it. God, we come to you this morning and we ask that you would protect our hearts and our minds as your people. Lord, that you would be our truth, that we would look nowhere else for power or security or strength or support or guidance and direction, but to you and your word, that we would rest securely under the authority of your Son, that we wouldn't rely on political leaders or church structures, positions of hierarchy and power, that we wouldn't leverage our own thoughts and opinions over your own, but that we would always come back to your word, your revelation to us, not just here at the end of our scriptures, but the entirety of your revelation. God, we thank you for your word. We thank you for your Son. We trust in your plan. We submit to it today and each day going forward until you return for us. Amen.
jars of clay. So take this heart, Lord, I'll be your vessel, the world to see your life in me. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see you now. I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Oh, I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I once was lost, but now I am found. Was blind, but now I see. Oh, I can see the love. Oh, I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. I can see you now. I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. Oh, I can see you now. I can see the love in your eyes, laying yourself down, raising up the broken to life. richly